I'd like to welcome everyone to the session using Universal Design for Learning to enable students to actualize their own learning outcomes. And I want to thank you for choosing to be here. I'm Dr. Peggy Rosario, an assistant professor in the School of Business and Education at Gwynedd Mercy University. We're located in suburban Philadelphia, so I'm coming to you from the East Coast. Following is the description of this session. In the final project for the Ireland residency doctoral course, Universal Design for Learning principles were employed, offering students various options in covering topics and presenting their learning. This session will detail the course structure and modifications made to the course project. By showcasing examples from student projects, the session will demonstrate the advantages of using UDL in transforming the final project, allowing students to uncover significant personal learning outcomes. So the key outcomes for this session include understanding the application of Universal Design for Learning in enhancing student learning, observing how students actualize their learning through assisted assessments, and then finally, recognizing the importance of students expressing their personal learning outcomes. One of the things I'm curious about is what brought you to this session. So I'd like to do a quick round robin. If you could unmute and share who you are, what you teach, and what interested you about this session, that will enable me to try to customize what I talk about in the context of the people in the audience. Well, what I'd like to do is go ahead and get started. It's been so helpful for me to hear your backgrounds because where I'm coming from is a very different place than where you are, I should say. So we will all be challenged to try to take the messages from the session that I'm presenting right now and transfer those into your own context and setting. So the program, I should say the course that I'm going to discuss in this particular session is part of a doctorate in education program. So that is a very different subject matter from most of you and level of education. We offer at Gwynedd Mercy University a doctorate in either leadership, in K-12 or higher education, and also in teaching and learning in higher education. On the particular course that I'm talking about, I was faculty for the teaching and learning in higher education students. So the course that I'm going to talk about is Global Education in Policy and Practice. The course description is a review of global issues in education policy and practice with a focus on how education has become a global, not local enterprise, what forces influence education most every nation, and the role of cultural context. The course sequence for this particular course is it is the last of 3 residency courses within our doctoral program. All of our residency courses are accelerated and blended, but other courses in the program are 7 weeks online. The course format for this particular course involves the first and last weeks being online, and the second week is in Ireland. So to give you an idea of what we cover in the course, in the first week, we basically do an introduction to the history as well as global education. We do that in discussions in our online sessions, and we also have the students do a research paper on economics and education policy and practice. So they have that good foundation going into week 2 in Ireland. When we're in Ireland, we focus on 2 important aspects of learning. One is a research conference, and in that there are sessions presented by local educators in Ireland, both on research and global education that I will talk about in a bit. But we also do cultural and historical activities to give students that other lens on their learning. So they do a reflection on the cultural and historical aspects, and then an analysis of the research and global education that they learn about in Ireland. In the third week, they do a discussion on global education, and they conclude the course with a capstone. So before I talk about how I revised the capstone paper in this particular course, I want to talk about what universal design for learning is. When you think about universal design, it really focuses on making the environment accessible to everybody by removing barriers. Things like ramps, automatic door openers, and beeping crosswalk signals are all examples of how these are used in the physical environment. An organization called CAST focuses on how learning can be aided by universal design and created 3 principles: engagement, representation, and action expression. When you think about physical accommodations in our environment, they really benefit everybody. And using UDL principles in teaching, we benefit all students, whether they have an identified learning need or not. And that's why when I heard somebody talking about using UDL as a principle across the curriculum, I was really excited because it truly benefits all students. So let's talk about each of these principles one by one. Engagement, you can see the image here of the brain, focuses on affective networks and the why of learning. In the image, you can see highlighted in green the part of the brain that is activated with engagement. There are so many ways to engage students to be motivated to learn. Some examples are connecting current learning to past learning, asking students to share personal examples that relate to the learning, and giving students choices about what aspect of the topic they will focus on are all highly engaging strategies. I'm curious if anybody else has any strategies to share. If you want to type them in the chat of examples of things that you do to engage students, or if you'd like to unmute and share some examples. How do you get your students interested and engaged in their learning? Any thoughts? Yes, I love asking questions, making that connection to the real world. Using hooks, myths, or misconceptions is a great way to really get people thinking about the topic. Applying learning to daily life. Lab work, absolutely. Clinicals and lab work are perfect examples of engagement. Excellent. Some other examples, humor. I love that. Pre-testing is another way that you can help students think about what they already know about a topic and prepare them to then add new knowledge. Having students ask questions of interest about the topic is good. In-class activities for engagement. All of these are really wonderful ways to get students ready for the learning. So when you think about your course, if you don't really pay attention to these hooks and this engagement, the students aren't really primed and ready to accept the learning. It's just kind of forced on them. So that's why the affective networks are so critical to student learning. Let's move on to the recognition networks, which focus on the what of learning. And in UDL, we call this representation. A simple way to think about representation is instruction in all of its forms. You can see in the image, the purple part of the brain is active when representation is the focus of learning. The idea behind representation is that students have access to multiple ways to master the course content. Most courses, traditional courses, I should say, have readings and lectures. It's kind of the traditional way that we teach our students. And these are 2 different forms of representation. But in today's world, there are so many more options to expand representation with videos, podcasts, graphics, websites, concept maps, experiential learning, demonstrations. Because people learn differently, What works for one person's learning may not work well for another. Sometimes faculty look at offering instruction in multiple ways as too burdensome, but I like to think of it as kind of an addition. If each time you teach, you add a few more resources, you can gradually build up a really robust course, and then it doesn't feel so overwhelming. Be gentle on yourself and just look for ways that you can add different ways for students to learn. One of the most important ways to address the need for additional forms of representation is to focus on the aspects of the course that students have difficulty mastering and build resources in those areas first. Being prepared for students to find material challenging by offering multiple ways to learn the content will actually save you time in the future because students are more likely to understand by using these multiple resources. Another idea is to ask students to share what helped them learn difficult concepts, and that can result in peer learning. I'm curious about any unique forms of representation that you integrate into your teacher, beyond the traditional lecture and readings. What do you do to get creative in helping your students learn? Let's use the chat again and share some ideas. Telling stories. That is a fantastic example. Arts-based projects. YouTube and crash course PBS videos. Excellent. Peer teaching. That's a strategy we use a lot in doctoral education because people are bringing in so many diverse experiences. Chemistry lab with one-on-one time, group discussions. And virtual reality, what a great opportunity to give people the opportunity to learn in different ways. All wonderful examples. Thank you for sharing. The Ireland trip in the course I discuss in this session is a fantastic example of experiential learning. Another great example is to post a lecture recording so students can re-listen to something they found difficult to understand. When you think about the lecture, students get it one time. If they don't memorize it or capture it in notes, it's gone. So making those recordings allow students to go back, particularly if in a discipline where there's problem solving and you need to show steps of how a problem is solved, having a recording is just golden. I see another example of group projects and self-reflection on learning. I absolutely love those. Self-reflection is a huge part of what we integrated into this course. So let's focus on the final principle, and that is the strategic networks. These are shown in the brain in blue. A simple way to think about action and expression is that it involves the methods to assess student learning. Traditional courses may use examinations as the primary means of assessment, but there are so many more methods that can be used. What are some ways that you assess your students' learning? I think group projects and discussions you already talked about in communicating information, but they're also a great way to assess learning. What are some other ways? Let's share in the chat. Rubrics. Excellent. Journaling. I love that. Demonstration. So important. If you can demonstrate the learning, you know somebody has it. Demo projects. Yes. All great examples. One of the things that I want to point out when you think about how you assess student learning, the most important thing to remember is that it doesn't really matter how they demonstrate the learning as long as they're able to do so. When we limit assessments to just one or a few forms, students who struggle with those forms of assessment may not be able to demonstrate their learning, not because they lack the learning, but because the assessment creates barriers for them. So that's an important consideration. I know in some disciplines, nursing being one, they have to be able to pass the NCLEX. So that is a standardized test that you obviously need to integrate into the assessment of nursing student learning. However, if students are able to master the content in another way, giving them that sense of a success and acknowledgement can then help them perform better on that standardized test because they know the content and they'll be able to demonstrate it in multiple ways once they show they've mastered it. The more options we can give students to demonstrate their learning, the more likely we are to have a true measurement of their learning. In March, I'm going to be doing a poster presentation at a conference that describes how I utilize UDL in discussions to maximize student choice. In that session, I will talk about how I allow students to choose whether to do, and this is in online courses, live discussions, a written post, an oral recording, a video, or even use a Padlet or PowerPoint to express their ideas. The way they express their ideas is not important to me, rather it's the content of their learning. And since I started offering these options to my students, I've found greater engagement, greater enjoyment, and truly a celebration of their learning. Does anyone have other examples of how they offer choices in assessment? Do you give students different options when you give them assignments? I'm curious if you're already doing that. A really simple example could be choosing the topic of a research paper. That is a choice. Excellent. Choices for completing projects, websites, demo types. Great example. So this is the basic overview of Universal Design for Learning. So I want to take a moment to stop and see if anybody has questions. Are there any points of confusion, perhaps what you've heard about Universal Design for Learning and the way I'm communicating it? Anything that you want to check about? So I see a question about a tool used to equally grade students across different types. Yes, rubrics are really important, and you have to think about when you construct them that you're constructing for multiple formats. So you're looking more for content rather than how that learning is expressed, if that makes sense. So Diana verified that she uses rubrics as well. Any other questions about Universal Design for Learning? The biggest thing I hear when people hear about this is that it's just overwhelming. I can't possibly do it. And my response to that is always do a little. And each time you do that little bit and you add it the next time you teach, you're building and building and building. And I've really had a trajectory myself in how I integrate Universal Design for Learning. And I have to tell you, it just makes me love teaching more and more and more because I see the students' enthusiasm and success around it. So let me explain to you the original capstone assignment. This is what, up until last spring, all students did. They wrote a paper that reflects on the three major drivers of education: economic development, human rights, and the preservation of culture, traditions, and religion. So it was a very specific prompt. It had three required sections. And within those sections, there were specific questions to answer. There was a tiny bit of UDL in this assignment, though, because the suggested questions did not all have to be answered. So students could choose to answer a few questions from each section. So there was a bit of choice. The other interesting thing about the capstone is that it focused on synthesis of prior learning. All of the outcomes in the course were already met through the prior assignments. So I had a really nice luxury here of not needing to worry about any specific outcomes being met by this assignment, because basically it covered everything in the course and just emphasized and resynthesized their learning. So that gave me the opportunity to really think about what could we do in addition to this option. So I call it UDLing it, giving the students freedom to figure out what's most important to them. So this is the UDL option I gave them. Through words, images, PowerPoint, video, or any combination of these, create a work that captures the impact of your Ireland experience or focuses on one or more aspects of it that were particularly meaningful to you. You have complete freedom in how you approach this. So the students could do the original prompt or they could do this. Anybody want to guess how many people did the original prompt? Nobody. Everybody chose this. And I think when you look at the components of universal design for learning, it's very easy to see why students would want to do this. So the engagement was there because they could pick what was most meaningful to them. They weren't being told you have to focus on X, Y, and Z. They engaged with the content the way they wanted to. When it came to the representation, they pulled their learning from their experiences, but many of them also did additional research because it was of interest to them, and that helped build up their project. And then finally, in the action and expression, they were given complete freedom to choose to do whatever they wanted. So one of the things that was really exciting for me during this residency course is I could see the depth and the power of these students learning, but I knew the capstone assignment wouldn't capture it. So being able to do this revision and giving them the option to share their learning as they wish, I really got a lot more understanding of the impact of the course. And I think the students really gained a greater appreciation of their own learning by taking the opportunity to do this. So what were some of the approaches the students took? One student wrote about challenging assumptions and biases using a presentation with words and images. She looked at the role of education in social justice and inclusion and leading change. Another student wrote a letter to her younger self about the impact of the experience. One student reflected on the need for higher education through images of Ireland and the words of great thinkers. One student recorded a video with reflections and images and actually implemented one of the technologies he learned about in the Ireland Educational Conference into his presentation. Two others decided to create a Padlet. I don't know if you're familiar with that online tool, but it allows you to integrate images and words and videos. And then several students created PowerPoints that integrated words and images. One student also added commentary to her PowerPoints. For the session today, I got approval from my students to share words from their capstone assignments. Deciding to UDL the capstone in this course was such a rewarding experience for my students and me in making their learning more meaningful. And I decided I'm always going to continue to offer this UDL option. So let me tell you a little bit about their experiences in my words and then theirs. The residency took place at the University of Limerick in Ireland, and this was a fantastic example of higher education for our students to learn from. The picture that you see on the right there is called the Living Bridge, which crosses the River Shannon and connects two sides of the campus that are in different counties in Ireland. The design intention behind the Living Bridge was to celebrate this environment with a structure that threaded through the landscape and invited users to linger and engage with their surroundings. The bridge is a deliberately modest visual statement spanning at a low level and with minimum impact to create an organic relationship between nature, the bridge, and the user. We learned that sometimes classes are held on the bridge, as well as special events. One of my students included a picture of the bridge in her capstone and wrote, "Education bridges where we are and where we want to go with social justice and inclusion." She goes on to state, what are some considerations for education? what systemic barriers exist, and what needs to be created to benefit broader groups of students. How can shared leadership, including the student voice, strengthen diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts? Without the connection between the images and words in the capstone, the student may have been less likely to identify that connection. Another student noted in relation to the bridge, they value nature, they build within the natural environment. And this was actually a student who works in technology, so building is really important to him. By being given the opportunity to reflect on what resonated, identifying values is an important insight. One of my students, who is a sports management faculty member, visited the University of Limerick sports arena on her own time. It's the largest in the country. She was inspired to learn more about where we were related to her teaching, which is a great example of her leveraging the representation principle of UDL. She sought out additional information. So while we were at the University of Limerick, we learned about Ireland's educational system. We learned that it's under national control. So unlike the US, where each state has a department, Ireland is like its own state. Gaelic is taught in schools, and teachers need to be proficient in Gaelic in order to be employed in primary and secondary schools in Ireland. A student reflected, the Irish language of Gaelic continues to be taught in their schools, although not favored by the younger generation. It's important to the Irish people to maintain its history. I couldn't help but think about the African people stripped from their native lands, culture, language, food, etc., to be lost in slavery. This was a powerful connection from this African-American student. We heard two interesting presentations on inclusive education. One focused on technologies to help students with various needs. The student who did the video used the captioning technology that he learned about in this session to enhance his video. The other inclusive education presentation focused on the experiences of a professor, Dr. Teresa Shields, who suffered a head injury and how she was able to work through these challenges and receive her doctorate. One of my students included a photograph from that presentation with the quote from George Evans, "Every student can learn, just not on the same day or in the same way." Dr. Patricia Mannix McNamara is the head of the School of Education at the University of Limerick. And she shared some really important advice that was quoted in one of the students' projects. She said, in a bullying room, double down on ethics and values. So talking about these interpersonal issues was a really important part of the session that would not have been captured in the original capstone project. My student who wrote a letter to her younger self wrote, "The feeling you will experience as you sit in the University of Limerick's lecture hall is one that you have been craving in your professional career, a feeling you will spend your doctoral years researching." So she made that connection between the research and her experience, a sense of belonging. "The feeling of belonging will comfort you like a cozy blanket wrapped around your shoulders, or the sensation of a hot cup of cocoa warming you from the inside out on a cold, damp day. It's a feeling of peace, acceptance, security, and it will be made possible by the connections you experience with the amazing people you'll meet on this journey." She went on to describe the impact of the individuals who presented. "Some of the people you meet will be a brief cameo in your life story and are meant to share their wisdom and amazing stories with you. Neve will remind you to be grateful for the gift of life and to be gentle with the people you meet, for everyone is fighting a battle you know nothing about. He will inspire you to stop trying to prove yourself and rather focus on improving yourself. Patricia will rekindle your passion for teaching and remind you to do the best you can with what you have to help all students learn. Teresa will inspire you to overcome any obstacle that comes across your path and remind you that you can do hard things." In our sessions, we also covered a variety of research topics. like searching for sources and writing the literature review, but one of the most impactful sessions was on imposter syndrome. One of my students wrote, "At the end of each day, each group and their professor met to reflect on the day's events. We enjoyed this part of the day to learn and share with my classmates. The discussions were often emotional as we discussed a variety of issues faced in our professions." In a sense, the academic program was the most traditional learning we experienced in Ireland because of the kind of lecture discussion format. But what made it different was the emphasis on interpersonal relationships and caring for each other. So many times we focus on content rather than feelings, and this conference allowed us to do both. And I could see in the students' works just how strongly that resonated for them. Another thing we did in the residency week was learn about and participate in some competitions. The Picture This competition was an opportunity for students at the University of Limerick to illustrate their doctoral research with a picture. They did a competition where they put the pictures with a brief description on social media and let the public vote. And then the 15 most popular images went forward to the final, where a committee of faculty and administrators picked the winners. So the image that you see here is the 2022 winner topic, which was focused on gender equality in farm ownership. So you can see how a picture can tell 1,000 words. The Thesis in 3 competition was held for Gwynedd Mercy students. The challenge was to present in 3 minutes using one slide to explain their dissertation research. A committee of faculty judged the presentation and picked winners. One of my students won first place and another got second place. A number of students reflected in their capstones on the impact of participating in that competition in boosting their confidence and deepening their connection to their research. You can see how both of these activities and competitions really integrated multiple means of expression that are very different than the typical written dissertation or paper. So they're great examples of UDL in action. When it came to cultural activities, throughout the week, we would make short trips to give students experiences related to the history and culture of Ireland. Visiting King John's Castle was the first cultural activity we did after arriving in Limerick. One student included a picture of the stairs in King John's Castle with the caption, "Don't stop, goal sighted, keep climbing." And she discussed how the physical challenge of walking up the stairs in that tower compared to the challenge of writing her dissertation. Another student wrote some considerations for education. Whose lens and perspective is used to tell the story? What is included? What is left out? Who benefits from this telling of history and who does not? One of my students wrote a caption for a picture of the castle, "The verb to undermine, to make someone less powerful or confident, takes its figurative meaning from the physical act of building mines with the aim of weakening the structure overhead," which we learned as part of the history of the castle. She followed that with an image that captured all of the ways education is undermined in the US and Ireland. While this analysis could have been included in the original capstone paper, it was much more impactful when images were combined with the quotes and analysis. We took a cruise on the River Shannon in Killaloe and visited St. Flannan's Cathedral, which was built in 1212. This visit had a strong impact on several students. One student wrote, "I've not felt too connected to the church because of the world we live in. However, I still appreciate the beauty of the church. Once I walked into the cathedral, I was consumed by my previous positive feelings of the church." Another student observed, "It made me reflect on the constant battles that the Irish people went through because of the British invasion and the imposition of Protestantism and the English language. It goes to show how resilient the Irish people were and still are. I commend them for fighting for their rights and the preservation of their culture for many years." One of my students decided to write 6-word stories to reflect on her experience in Ireland. She wrote, "Beautiful hills belie tales of inhumanity," which really reflected all we learned about the history of Ireland. We were treated to Irish music and dancing several times during our trip. One student shared a picture of the Irish musicians and paired it with a Mahatma Gandhi quote, "A nation's culture resides in the hearts and in the souls of its people." Cliffs of Moher is one of my favorite places to visit because of its natural beauty. One of my students reflected, "Spiritually, the journey certainly displayed God's hand in the creation of this place. One can only imagine what life was like when the Vikings landed there and they navigated the terrain." You can see how UDL enabled students to connect both their learning and their feelings. My student's letter to her former self stated, "Ireland will charm you with its beautiful scenery, castles, accents, culturally rich history, locals, and whiskey, but it's the power of human connection from the people you meet along the way that will have a lasting impact on your life. You will return home a little more confident, cultured, humbled, and grateful with words of advice, fueling the next final leg of your journey. So don't stop worrying and enjoy the ride. You got this." Several students use this image, "Everything is possible, even the impossible," in their capstone projects. It was from a fairy garden trail at Bunratty Castle. It really illustrates their dedication to persevering through their dissertation. One student wrote, "The trip changed my outlook on life, education, friendship, learning, and exploring. It empowered me to keep curious. I feel inspired to pass this experience on to my students." This is truly transformative learning at its best. So you can see by the examples that I shared, choice truly created engagement for these students with their learning. And the creativity and approach made the expression more meaningful. Being able to use pictures was something that every student, except the one who wrote the letter to her former self, did. So that imagery was incredibly powerful. I think that students made unexpected connections and applications that would not necessarily have been made had they been answering the questions and addressing the sections of the original assignment. And then finally, I think you could really feel the emotional impact come through in what they shared in their experiences. It was truly transformational. So what I'd like to do now is stop for a moment, because I know my example was something that is unlike probably anything that you're doing in your classes. But you might have gotten some ideas about things you could use. What are some challenges that you think you might face in trying to integrate UDL into your teaching practice? Feel free to use the chat, or if you want to unmute and share a question, I would love to hear what you think. Or did I do such a good job that you're all like, yes, we got it? Any challenges? Lack of time. I think that is really, really important. And just like you said, fighting old habits. You get comfortable teaching the way you're teaching. So thinking about, how can I add something new? How can I add something different? Can be a little bit scary. And I have to be honest, I shared the example about the discussions and allowing students to pick their favorite way was sometimes challenging for me, because I am very visual, not as much auditory. So if a student chose to do a video for UDL and accessibility, they needed to have a transcript. I would read the transcript rather than listen to it, because that was my preference. But knowing that they preferred to create that video benefited them, and it didn't hurt me. Oh, so having choice, but having the students produce equally powerful results can be a challenge. Yes. It's interesting with student pushback. So I think, the way I presented the project was, here's the original assignment. Feel free to do that. Or here's another option for you. So if students don't want choice, you could always present it in such a way to say, here's, the original way that I conceive of this assignment. And if you don't want a choice, go for it. But if people want to try something different, here's some other options. I love the idea of, don't throw everything away. Just make little enhancements. Really, really important part. Yeah, because anything you do is truly a step in the right direction. So what are some ideas you did get? What's a nugget that you're going to take back and try to integrate into your own practice? Feel free to use the chat, or if you want to unmute and share some ideas you have, I'd love to hear it. Interesting question. Is there judgment from other faculty members that perceive these alternative types of showing knowledge as less rigorous? I think it really depends on the faculty that you're working with and being able to really examine the artifacts of learning and talk about, are we getting similar forms of learning? And if you aren't, are there additional guidelines that you can provide to make sure that you're getting that rigor that you're looking for? If you're in a writing class, you're probably not going to let people get away with not writing papers. Writing a paper is really important, but some students might prefer to present it orally. They still had to write it in order to say it. So, thinking about those alternatives can be helpful. Oh, interesting idea. Images and text as a ticket out the door. Fixed mindset definitely could be a challenge. So trying to think about how can you help people get beyond that. And for some people, they're going to want to stick with the traditional. And the beauty of UDL is you can. That's one of the choices, to do things in a traditional way. But for those that prefer to do things in a different way, it can be really, really impactful. When I started offering my options for how students do their discussions, most people still type their answers. But every once in a while, somebody would do something different. And it was really fun to see how they did it and how the peers reacted. And I think once somebody breaks out of the mold, it really helps people take that chance and start to think about their learning a little differently. So before I close, we have about 4 minutes left. Are there any other general questions that you would like to ask related to this topic? Or in general, you want to join our doctoral program and go to Ireland with me? I included my name and email address here. You're welcome to contact me. But any other questions that I can answer for you today? I hope each of you was able to make some connection between what I shared and what practice you can enhance moving forward. That's so important to me. And I noticed you talked about the fun to evaluate. Absolutely. One of the things I love about this class now is, what are they going to do in their final project? Instead of looking at a paper where students are basically answering the same questions, to have all of these creative expressions, it makes my job really fun. It's a joy to do assessment. How many times do you have the opportunity to say that in your job? All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for being here. I'm not seeing any final questions, so I will go ahead and end the session. But thank you, everybody. It's been great to share this information and to have your interest. I encourage you to visit CAST, cast.org to learn more about Universal Design for Learning. They have a lot of wonderful resources, including a specific section of videos for higher education. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.